Hello, I'm going to move on to my third lecture in this module about mathematics education in the digital age, promise and reality, looking at another example of putting into practice with a particular emphasis on programming and computational thinking. So from my previous lecture too, I hope it's clear that my background is very much in mathematics, but I was inspired by the vision of Seymour Papert and the potential of logo programming and constructionist approach to learning for promoting what is the goal of all my research, which is mathematical habits of mind. But I've recognised the importance of student empowerment and their voice in all of this, because too many students are not engaged or feel fearful about mathematics. And also, throughout this research and endeavour, we need to acknowledge the critical importance of teaching and scaffolding the learning of our students and also the teacher. So let me just look at a program and reflection on a program. This is underpinning, if you make a program, it's an external instantiation of what you're thinking. And reflection on that program can reveal how something is made. So you can see how it's built up, its structure, and this points to the important processes in programming of building, and after you've built it, to trace in your mind what the program might do, envisage what will happen, and then debug, try it, and then see it maybe not goes quite as you anticipated, debug, and all through this process, share, contrast with other people's approaches and discuss them. And so in our latest project that I'm going to be talking about, we use Scratch, which is an amazing phenomenon with millions of users across the world, an automatic translation of the language of the blocks. And let me just show you a program for a polygon. If you read that, you see, first of all, the different blocks, because they are doing different things. I won't go into details here, but you can define something for a polygon. You have a number of sides, that's a variable. And then you move a side length, and that's also a variable. But then once you've moved that side length, how far do you turn so you get a closed polygon? And then you're bringing in some mathematical relationships. You can read that with a mathematical lens. But the point with Scratch, and indeed other languages, you can build these programs by clicking these blocks together like a jigsaw. As I used to say in the old days, it was purely text-based, but now you have something which is more manipulable and more concrete. So what do we know about programming from a lot of the research that I mentioned in my previous lecture about programming in mathematics? There is evidence that through programming, students can explore mathematics in different representations and link them. And you might remember from my first lecture that actually it's moving from representation to representation. It can disrupt what you're thinking and makes you more aware of the mathematical structures that define the mathematics. You can explore geometry, geometric structures and relationships. Obviously, from Logo and Scratch, you can look at turtle geometry. And we can also look at the use of variables. But fundamentally, by focusing on the programming activity, you can gaze in reasoning and problem solving around certain mathematical topics that you are programming. But I claim, and many others do along with me, that unless learning to programming is carefully designed, sequences and scaffolded, it is only the advantaged learners who tend to have the most to gain. That is, in the old days, it used to be the boys who used to put their hands up first and who would take over the scarce machines. Now it may be the more advantaged, the brightest, or seen to be the brightest. So we have to be aware of that, because this is particularly true as so many of us in the constructionist movement, we want to open access learning to more people. So the key question for us all in mathematics education is, what does society need for mathematics and maths education? It's a big question that we have to keep asking ourselves. And these are some of the reasons I've gleaned from the literature and my own experience. We obviously want everybody to be comfortable with quantitative understandings and fluency in those mathematical procedures, the mathematical machinery, as mathematicians say. We want them to be able to move around in it. We don't want disconnected facts and procedures. Clearly, we must develop an appreciation of the existence of the mathematical models that underpin so much of what we do, and the main variables and relationships in these models. This is so apparent in science, in some of the key issues of our time, such as climate change. Indeed, understanding the pandemic is all about the mathematical models of how the virus is spreading. But also we need to be our learners, all of us, to be able to reason logically and quantitatively in different curriculum areas. I mentioned science, but also more generally, and around important social issues. But crucially too, we have so many tools now, we need to know how to use those tools effectively. And goodness, we have learnt a lot about how to use them effectively in the pandemic. But they will shape what we want to do and how we want to shape these tools to follow the agenda we want to follow. Actually writing this about the importance of mathematical models reminded me of a project I had, and we wrote a book with myself, Richard Noss, Philip Kent and Arthur Backer, all based in the UCL Knowledge Lab. It's called Improving Mathematics at Work and the Need for Techno-Mathematical Literacies. And I guess what the main headline from that project was actually how invisible so many to so many people were these models that govern what we do, what we think, big issues of our time. We need to make those models more visible in order to be able to adjust to them and understand them. As well, in my key question for us all, we want to be able to adapt flexibly to new demands. We want to be able to work collaborative and communicate across boundaries. Goodness, that's important for teachers to communicate with students, for maths educators to communicate with mathematicians, etc. So then the question, which I asked in my first lecture, is given all the research in the past, with, let's admit, variable outcomes, why should we do better now in terms of using digital technologies in our maths teaching and learning? And I think we have a big case that we are better now. We have more potential because there's much more awareness of the mathematical models. There are many more freely available, really powerful digital tools to explore different areas in mathematics. So let's use them. There is also a key recognition of the critical role of the teacher and the need for professional learning. We must take that into account. There's much wider access in most countries to the web, in homes and in schools. And as I mentioned, there's lots now of mathematical digital tools and curriculum materials that embed these tools, and they're widely available and freely available. There is also, much more important actually than all of that, a widespread recognition of a real danger, that disadvantage can be made worse by this digital divide. Actually, digital technology is more widespread, but unless we make sure that we really make sure that everybody takes advantage of these tools, we could be making the situation in general, but in mathematics in particular, worse. And I'm now going to talk about a particular example of a new context. It was new then when it started, and it's an example from England. We used to have an IT, then an ICT curriculum in England from around 2010. There was growing dissatisfaction in it as it was teaching how to use software. So the ICT curriculum taught how to use Word, PowerPoint, but it didn't focus on what it was about or gave no insight into how it was made. And this has been a real wave of enthusiasm for programming and thinking about that. We had Royal Society, which is our major scientific society, issue these 2 reports, which ended in a new statutory national computing curriculum. Different countries have gone through this trajectory differently, but in England we have a statute that means every school has to do it in England for pupils aged 6 to 16. And it started in 2014, so it's quite embedded now. But the key aspect of this curriculum is that every pupil should design, build and debug programs. Now that is a massive change. We have a National Centre for Computing Education that does have a really brilliant job in supporting teachers with lots of materials. I'm on their advisory board and I will say what a wonderful job they're doing. But the key question for me, as in computing and mathematics, is how does programming, that now every student must do, fit with the maths curriculum at every level, primary, secondary, and even college and university? Because there's all this experience of programming. How are we going to exploit it in different parts of the curriculum, but for me, for mathematics? There's an interesting shift in the vocabulary or how in the discourse about what we're doing, from talking about programming, which we did earlier many years ago, to promoting computational thinking. More of that anon. Let me go back to our project. We had a big project. It was developed a 2-year curriculum for teacher and pupil with materials from 9 to 11-year-olds in England. That's a top primary. It was aligned to the statutory English National Computing Curriculum, the new one, with the National Maths Primary Curriculum, which has been around, changed, but always there and very fundamental. So we had to make this alignment between these two curriculum and look at the parts of the curriculum where there is a clear overlap. And we wanted to support the teaching of these carefully selected core ideas of computer programming alongside fundamental mathematical concept. So we aimed, if you like, to develop computational thinking alongside mathematical thinking around these core concepts. And I wanted to mention that we had a big team. They're interdisciplinary. This work is interdisciplinary for those of us in maths and maths education, because it was led by Richard Noss and myself, but also many others, computer scientists and also computing people. Thank you. So what do we mean by computational thinking? I'll quickly list our definition. There are many definitions around. But for those of you from mathematics, you'll see there's close alignment with mathematical thinking. So seeing a problem and its solution at many levels, that's abstraction. Thinking about tasks as a series of logical steps, algorithms. Understanding that solving a large problem can involve breaking it down into a set of smaller problems, decomposition. And appreciating that a new problem is likely to be related to other problems. This is what you do all the time in mathematics. Think about one problem. How does it relate to other problems the learner might have already solved? Pattern recognition. And finally, realising that the solution to a problem can be made in ways that can solve a range of related problems. So you don't just solve the problem you're in thinking about now, but related problems. That's generalisation. So we thought about computational thinking alongside mathematical thinking. And this is where I see programming in that intersection. But I want to mention too, one of the, maybe say, limitations of computational thinking is it sometimes disregards that whole area of computational literacy I talked about in my lecture too, this history of programming and mathematics with a big vocabulary and literature behind it. So these were the phases of ScratchMaths. These are the phases which you always go through when you're designing an innovation, embedding digital technology. You have iterative design of the tools, the materials, and also the professional development of a small group of teachers and schools. Then you try to move to scale. And then we had professional development. We really wanted to take this seriously in regional hubs around our country. And we had formative evaluation of how it was going. And then we had summative evaluation. What were the outcomes in terms of what we wanted was computational thinking and mathematics learning. And now we're in the stage of impact and dissemination. And in some ways that's the most exciting because different countries are taking up the ScratchMaths curriculum, adapting it to their own context, which is right and proper, and also making it better. So one of the outcomes of the ScratchMaths project was a very explicit pedagogical framework. We called it the 5 E's. To explore, to investigate, try things out, debug in reaction to feedback. You envisage, you write a program, you think about it and you envisage, predict. I wanted to have it beginning with E's. So you envisage what it will do, predict the outcome. It's collaborative, so you explain to others what you think this program will do, and the reasons why you chose those particular programming tools. So underpinning this is exchange, collaborate and share to see your problem from different points of view, the different programs that will come up with different solutions. And what was important and what we learned so much from all our previous work with programming is we should make explicit links to the maths curriculum. We called it Bridge. We wanted to have an E, so the E is at the end. And I just want to mention in computing, there's a PRIM framework: predict, run, investigate, modify, make. Very similar to ours, and we should build bridges between the two. So another outcome of the ScratchMaths project is a 2-year instructional sequence, all backed by materials and teacher support. So the first year, age 9 to 10 years, where the emphasis is developing computational thinking, with the maths more implicit. And then those students get a year older, and we have in year 2 still teacher support materials where the emphasis is on mathematical thinking with more explicit mathematics. So we actually looked at things like coordinates, more explicit geometry, and developing algebra. We have 2 days of professional development. But I have to note here, because it so affected our project, at the end of year 6, which was coming to the end of our project time, all students in England take a very high stakes test. It's called the National Mathematics Test, Key Stage 2, and that affects the future of the schools and the teachers. So here are our outcome. There's materials. Look at in the first year with the computing focus, it's about tiling patterns, beetle geometry, collaborating sprites, really exploring the environment of Scratch. Then in year 6, we have a more mathematical focus, building with numbers, exploring mathematical relationships, coordinates and geometry. And I wanted to note that all these materials are updated to Scratch 3 and available on the UCL website. All through ScratchMaths project, we have a blended learning approach. It's not all on the computer. This is not the right way to do it. You have on and off computer, and you try and supplement and explain and move that change of representation. And there's lots of support for the different modes of classroom interaction in the 3 E's. This is an example of our off computer we call unplugged tasks. Very rich for teachers and students, where you have a set of Scratch commands, and you have to predict what you think that those commands will produce, and then you sketch it out. It's quite an interesting exercise, which I obviously won't do now, but it's a wonderful thing to do. We implemented ScratchMaths at scale with 7 regional hubs around the country. We had 110 primary schools, nearly 3,000 students, so big. And we did try to do professional development in each region by our UCL team, but also by the hub leaders. And then independent for our funders, which was the Education Endowment Fund, part of their conditions, you appointed an independent evaluator to evaluate our project. And looking back on it, I don't think I noticed very much that hubs were mainly, if not all, by the end, computing and not maths. I think computing was the new person on the block, and so they were keen to set up new hubs of support. Maths has been around rather longer. So let me just share with you the findings of this. They did a randomised control trial, the evaluators did, we didn't, they did, in terms of mathematical learning and also computational thinking. The assessment of mathematics learning by our standardised maths national tests at age 11. First of all, they found a positive and significant impact on computational thinking in year 5. That's after the first year of our project, so a really good result. And even better for us, that this was particularly evident among disadvantaged pupils, that those who didn't have free school meals, so the students who you'd expect not to do so well, actually did significantly better than expected using ScratchMaths. We found it very exciting too, although I must admit the evaluators weren't quite so excited by it. There was no difference between girls and boys. Why we were excited in the areas of computing and maths, so often it's the boys who streak the girls. Sadly though, there was absolutely no evidence of impact on the national key stage 2 tests. However, our evaluators, independent from us, said that ScratchMaths is an affordable way to cover aspects of the primary computing curriculum in maths lessons without any adverse effect on core maths outcomes. Now, this sounds not terribly positive, but it is, because they're saying there is an overlap and it will affect computing curriculum and enhance computing scores and not be disadvantageous to maths scores, as tested in our standardised maths tests, which are very traditional. You can find all the reports here. So, from our formative evaluation, we did note, not surprisingly, there was, in terms of, although we had professional development all around the country in our hubs, there was huge variation in pedagogy. We wanted it to all to conform to the 5 E's, but not all of it did. Computing was new. Lots of teachers weren't very confident. Maths was scary, still is, I'm afraid. And there were these lethal mutations. For example, where nobody actually looked at the programming, tried the programs and played about, which was the whole idea. And undoubtedly, we suffered from the effects of this high-stakes testing at the end of year 6. So what we really need when the teachers are more confident, and maybe we don't have such high-stakes testing at the end, we could return later and look at this. There have been replications of ScratchMaths in various countries, certainly in Australia and New Zealand, but one in particular, a big one, was in Spain, where the ministry translated everything and implemented an online teacher training course with 310 teachers across Spain, about 4,000 students, so a large number. And they evaluated the effects on computational thinking and maths through pre-post tests, not randomised control as we did. But I do want to just note their results because it resonates with what we found in England. And they showed that it was possible to include programming activities in the 5th grade in the area of mathematics, so that students not only learn to program, which is such an important skill, and engage in computational thinking, so important too, but also that improve the development of their mathematical competence greater than their colleagues who worked in the same area using other types of activities not related to programming. So again, there is evidence, growing evidence, that this approach could benefit computing and maths. Let me just reflect on what I think personally are the limitations of our project at the time. We did the best we can, but things have moved on. The assessments of student outcomes in maths and computing. Maths was done by these key stage tests, which took no account of the changing context of the curriculum in England with the computing curriculum there. I think we need more fine-tuned and nuanced quantitative student outcomes in terms of maths and computing. So what were the students actually learning in maths around algebra or geometry, for example? We need a better assessment of teacher outcomes, their understanding of the computational concepts and competence and confidence in teaching them. After all, this was a new area. I think we need better assessment of what actually happens in classrooms, actual practices in classrooms. What were the fidelity measures? How were the 5 E's and this bridging to the maths curriculum? How was it supported by teachers? And I also want to point to a special issue of digital experiences in maths education on supporting these transitions across and beyond digital experiences. And again, I can't emphasise enough, we want to emphasise there's importance of a real commitment to teacher professional development. Because let's face it, programming, computational thinking is a new idea, and we need to make sure the teachers are confident in it themselves. However, despite these reservations, I still believe that this is a great chance for mathematics and for computing. In fact, that is a quote from a colleague of mine at the National Centre for Computing Education, who said that computing and maths are genuinely symbiotic. It's not just a way to do maths better, but a way to do better maths and better computing too. And we have a wonderful video of our classrooms in ScratchMaths, and one of the kids who was doing a programming, did all the building the programming, pressed the button, think what would happen and said, goodness, it's like magic in front of my eyes. But now I pause. ScratchMaths is now been around a while. It is implemented in a lot of classrooms all over the world. But can we move on in terms of opening access to mathematics and computing among all groups? I do think there's still a journey to be undertaken. Are our practices still continuing the injustice and exclusion felt by so many in maths contexts? I think we can now revisit that. We now have the tools and the curriculum to think, how can we make sure these are implemented in ways that make sure everybody's involved? How can we take seriously these different representations? We don't always have to have the paper and pencil representation, embodied approaches, and then bridging to standard mathematics. And do we need to broaden our focus of study and reassess what we value in computing and in mathematics? This will take us to the next step. Thank you. Oh, I've got a selected bibliography of all that. Thank you very much.